Adam, how are you?
Very, very good. You?
I'm good too, yeah. So, hi everyone, this is Adam Nathaniel Furman. Talking to us from what looks like a cupboard somewhere in London. Where are you exactly, Adam?
Or as Charles Holland asked, he's like, "Are you in a pub?" I'm actually in my grandmother's apartment. Hence the sort of old school decor, and me sort of very slowly taking it over with my Post-it notes.
And welcome to today's Screen Time interview as part of Virtual Design Festival, sponsored by Philips TV and Sound. So Adam, apart from being in your grandmother's cupboard, what else can you tell us about yourself? Who are you and what do you do?
I'm a designer and artist working in, I've one of those sort of, I guess, called slashers or slashies who've done lots of different things, but it's mostly because I've done whatever has come my way, but it's sort of settling into large-scale installations, interiors, and products. But my background's in architecture. I studied at the AA and CSM, and also have taught in architecture as well.
And we've met a few times. I remember a couple of years ago, we did a discussion together about the legacy of Sotsas and the Memphis movement. And I'd vaguely heard of you. I think it was me, you, and Dezeen Awards.
Yes.
I was like astonished about how much you knew about Memphis and Sotsas. I was like, my God, this guy is really bright. I felt like
And boy.
Especially with Dezeen there as well. I felt like the idiot in the room. So how did you pick up all this knowledge about design? How did you start out and become a designer?
So I was one of those kids that was like weirdly obsessed with buildings and design, even when I was really little. And I remember like going to the Barbican and walking around the city of London when I was like 8 years old and just looking at buildings. And that was like way more fun than sports for me. Sports was definitely not a good thing. And then I thought that I wasn't like clever enough to do architecture at the end of high school. And so I went to CSM, Central St. Martin's, to do the foundation course. And there was this like amazing teacher there called Saskia Lewis, who basically like went, "You're quite good, it's okay." And she sort of walked me by hand to applying to the AA. And so I got into architecture. And it was just like my dream come true. I mean, it's been no looking back. I sort of eat, sleep, dream, design and architecture ever since then. Holidays of visiting buildings and design museums.
And as you can see by the Post-it notes in the background, you're kind of a relentless drawer and sketcher.
Yeah, the sketchbooks are elsewhere, but yeah, Post-it notes are, if you got a really messy brain like mine, where everything is always jumbled up and you never remember anything, Post-it notes are a really good way of like making sure that you don't forget things. It's like a three-dimensional memory box.
And are the Post-it notes all over your grandma's house? Are you sort of gradually taking over?
Certain crucial points where I sit, they sort of grow. I'm not going to say virally because that's not a very positive thing anymore, but they do spread.
And why are you at your grandmother's house? You're looking after her?
No, so where we were living, a developer had taken over the building, and they refused to stop works, and we were basically having to go up 4 flights of stairs, squeezing past, literally touching people who were still working. So we just left. My grandmother's now in my parents' place, so we did a bit of like family musical chairs. So I'm currently staying in a really nice early 1960s housing estate in Hampstead that actually won the Civic Trust Award in 1961.
Well, I'm sure you could talk about that for hours and give us every last factual detail about the housing estate. But back to you. You've got quite an interesting mix, haven't you? You're from all kinds of different places.
Yeah, I mean, I'm very much a Londoner, and like I'm made by London. I think if I sort of ended up being brought up or born anywhere else, I would have been in big trouble. This city really, really fits me and made me. But my parents are from my dad's from Argentina. He's from a little town in Entre Rios called Concordia, which is on the Rio Uruguay, opposite Salto. And my mum is a bit odd, sort of Japanese Israeli. So she brought up in Japan and then went to Israel. And they fell in love in London. So yeah, sort of bit all over the place. And I was lucky enough when I was growing up to be visiting family on holidays and got to see Israel, Argentina, and Japan a lot when I was growing up.
And as I'm sure we'll see when you show us your presentation, your work kind of is a category unto itself. But how did you come up with this, again, as we'll see, extremely colourful, very decorative style, given presumably your influences were the same as most people, you know, Bauhaus and modernism and all of that kind of
Bauhaus
stuff.
was so colourful. People forget. I mean, the Bauhaus was like this mad place where people did like poetry courses and dancers dressed in giant primary forms. You know, beautiful weaving and stitching. And, you know, Kandinsky was teaching there. You know, Mr. Synesthesia, I smell colors. I think history has sort of flattened the legacy of modernism somewhat. And I wrote a book with Terry Farrell on sort of revisiting postmodernism, sort of like looking at the legacy of it again. And one of, I think the starting point I made was that modernism originally in its sort of early stages was an incredibly vigorous, unpredictable and diverse way of trying to express the new nature of modern society and modern economy that was changing so fast. And it only later got sort of squished into a very sort of boring set of fixed rules. So yeah, I really like Bauhaus. That was actually the first thing I was introduced to, but I always just saw the color of it and all the crazy things that were happening.
And what about the relationship between modernism and health? Because people have been making that comparison now with the coronavirus pandemic, that, you know, one of the things that modernism tried to do was sweep away the deprivation, the disease, the slums. It was a kind of the legacy that people like me think of as the legacy of modernism is in the kind of the sanatorium look in a way.
Yeah, I mean, I think architecture, just like with postmodernism, architecture and design tend to have a slightly different way of seeing these words than in other parts of the humanities. Because modernity, I was talking to someone in history and he's like, oh, modernity started in the 1500s. You know, the beginning of like scientific method and the idea of sort of trying to better our cities ourselves in a scientific manner. That wasn't, you know, modernism just allied that with a particular aesthetic, but it was going on all through the Victorian period. Neoclassicism was trying to rationalize the cities as well for the same purposes. So I'm a little bit suspicious about the kind of the joining of social good and transformation of our urban areas to one particular aesthetic. So I'm always very suspicious of that because it seems like quite an arbitrary union. And particularly in England, the greatest social housing that we have from before that period is all, you know, but it's not modernist.
Well, maybe it's just a question of the name that was stuck on the boilerplate of that movement then.
Yeah, and you know, when things need to be replicated and rolled out, it is, I think, out of necessity, they need to be turned into like a kit of parts that are replicable. So also with, you know, postmodernism, the way people look back on it now, they think, oh, funny colored pediments, big fat columns, because it got turned into something that was replicable and copyable, which is the point at which it sort of died, but also became really popular and successful. And I guess modernism was just the same thing when it started to be rolled out. And
so I'm just plugging in here. Just outside the door. And what about you then? Where do you fit into all these isms and historical movements? In any of them? Do you identify with any of them, or have you kind of created your own one?
Well, something that's been really nice to notice over the past, I guess, 3 or so years is that I think I'm part of, you know, these things, we're all part of a period and we're all part of a context. And whether we like it or not, we absorb the things around us. And I am part of a sort of group of London designers who have come up, who are about my age, over the past few years. And we all seem to have very similar interests. And I think people have sort of dismissed us as being like postmodern revival. But actually, I think it's a sort of, we're really passionate about a lot of things that were just ignored for a while during a period of sort of technophilia, which is design and architecture as a visual and cultural pursuit, which is highly aesthetic, sensual, celebratory of mixed cultures. And I kind of like that. Like yes, it picks and chooses and mixes from different periods, and it does look back. For instance, I wrote the book Revisiting Postmodernism on the 1960s, 70s, particularly, but it's very rooted in London now.
And who are the other people that you would categorize as being part of that same movement? And has that movement been defined? Has it got a name?
No, I mean, I'm sure it'll be given a name shortly. Somebody always likes to own something by giving it a name. But my favorite's obviously Yinka. who's fantastic. I think we're the same age. We're both from North London. I see sort of like my hero is Morag Myerscough, who's also been incredibly supportive. She's someone who really she shares her knowledge with younger designers, and really opened up the way for the type of work that we're doing now. Also, obviously, Camille Walala.
So you, Yinka Ilori, Camille Walala, Morag Myerscough. Why don't we give it a name now? Then we've kind of created a new movement live on Dezeen.
Well, there was New London Vernacular. Maybe there's just New London Fabulous now.
That'll do for now. Okay, Adam, why don't you fire up your presentation and we'll
Okay.
have a look at some New London Fabulous.
Oh, hang on, sorry, I did it. Of course, I clicked on the wrong thing. Share screen.
I mean, all kinds of things can go wrong when you're trying to share screen, Adam. Be careful there.
Yeah. I've learned from experience. I will be very careful.
Oh, you must tell me about that later.
Oh, yeah, I'll tell you later. I will. I just didn't want you to look at me differently during the talk if I told you before.
I've seen it all, mate.
I'm clean and sparkling, and I'm not naughty. So can you see a photo of me with a bunch of weird things in front of me?
Yeah.
Okay,
yeah.
cool. So I sort of studied at the Architectural Association, and graduated when Lehman Brothers collapsed, which was quite a difficult job market. And it was a little bit of a struggle to try and sort of get to do the type of work that I wanted to do for quite a long time. And a big breakthrough moment was getting getting to be one of the designers in residence at the Design Museum, which is this absolutely phenomenal program. Anybody watching who's a young architectural designer who wants a leg up, definitely apply for that program. And that year, it was 2013. The theme was identity, and you sort of propose a project in response to the theme. It was the last year that I was eligible. And it just happened that identity was literally, it's a theme that runs through all of my work and absolutely everything that I do. Visual culture as an embodiment of identity in a non-didactic way. And so I proposed this project where it was like a narrative where I would lock somebody into their flat, a young designer, for 3 months, like a hikikomori, like in Japan, where they literally live through their computers. And every single day, this person had to design an object out of a different material, which could either be made at home or be delivered, so 3D printed in some way, to the door. And each of these objects would become embodiments of a particular situation or an issue that the character was living through. So the idea was design separated from commercial concerns and separated from academic concerns, just design as personality, persona, identity. Of course, I ended up actually becoming this character and like not sleeping for about 3 months. I produced a huge quantity of these objects. And at the end, killed him. He died of a heart attack, taking far too much Pro Plus. And in the way that when you take like a artist's studio or a potter's studio and put it in a museum, it sort of conveys all of the kind of personality, character, and ideas of that artist or designer without necessarily having to read very much. The idea was to do the same thing. So to everything that I had made, everything that I had written, because he had to write all of the stories, each of these objects had like a full story, was then taken to the Design Museum. This is actually a photo of a second showing with only about a third of the objects, but this was kind of those huge tapes, sort of 8-meter long table full of objects with iPads and stories. And the idea was to show how new technologies can not necessarily be about just technology or solving problems. They can also be about us and our stories, but not necessarily in a didactic way, through atmospheres. And I think it worked very well. It was extremely important for me because it caught certain journalists' attentions. It caught Blueprint's attention and it won an award. And basically from that point, I started for the first time in my life to actually get opportunities to design things, which is absolutely invaluable. And it directly led to me winning the UK Rome Prize for Architecture the next year, which again, everybody who's eligible should apply. You get to go after COVID to live in Rome for 6 months, all paid for by the British Academy. You get to go to lectures, visit places, and do a research project. And mine was to do the same as Identity Parade, but at the scale of the city. So it was looking at the city as a repository of personal narratives and stories, which could then become physical objects. using the tool of the souvenir as a kind of vehicle for compressing all of these stories into physical objects. And so I went and I did like a whole bunch of stories every week. Or every other week, one story was published on the Architectural Review website. So they had to be kind of like really nicely packaged and well made with good visuals. And then each of those stories was turned into a ceramic souvenir. Just to give you an idea, the tallest ones of these are about 70 centimeters high. So they're quite large 3D printed ceramic objects. And the end result, there's sort of, you know, there's videos and reams of information and stories and designs, but the end result, and this is quite important for me, is these eloquent objects, which are all about conveying, yes, all of the ideas behind it, but without needing to read, just the atmosphere and the feeling of the project, the vibe of the project. So it's not really narrative, it's more atmosphere, but with lots of narrative behind it. And also, I guess, ideas here of sort of like queering urbanism coming in. Rowan Moore wrote a really nice quote about this. He says, it's bringing the camp back to Campo Marzio, which pretty much summarized the entire project. I can waffle about it forever, but it's bringing the camp to Campo Marzio. And this also allowed me to start doing design projects. This is Camp Design Gallery in Milan, who are my gallery. They're fantastic, and you know, they're called Camp, which is extremely appropriate for me. And I've done 2 collections for them. This is the second one, which was last year, exploring notions of contemporary ornament. So this is using Abed Laminati's new it's extremely high resolution color true high pressure laminate, where you can do extremely high resolution printing with colors that pop in real life in a way that you normally don't get with digital printing or normal CMYK. And we created a series of furniture pieces, which again have a narrative behind the ornament, and there's a story to it, but when you visit them, I think you do get a feeling of kind of like cross-cultural, international cross-fertilization of ornamental styles, and quite a lot of campness. The chair was pretty good at Basel for people taking selfies of themselves in front of it. And this is also stuff that's happening at a larger scale now. Yay. I'm one of those people that I will take any scale on. Like, my dream is to do a whole skyscraper, but I don't think I'll ever be allowed to do that. So for now, I'm doing these sort of slightly smaller sculptures. This is Gateways in King's Cross, which was a series of 4.4 meter high ceramic gateways. Each facade, again, has a different narrative behind it. But when you walk through it, you just get a feeling of sort of vibrant diversity. Each of the facades are made of different type of ceramics: stoneware, earthenware. This front one is İznik, made by the İznik Foundation in Turkey. It's a 500-year-old technique of hand painting tiles. And I think at the time this was the most photographed installation at London Design Festival up to that point, which was like, yeah. But also people used it a lot. They loved parading up and down it, and they would sort of get annoyed at each other when somebody was parading too many times because they wanted to have their go. And this is, again, taking the idea of sort of experiential atmospheric ornament with a story behind it, but that works on a sort of really simple way. In this case, in a hospital for wayfinding. This is at Chelsea and Westminster Maternity Centre. There's a series of about 5 large artworks made in ceramics, specially made tiled, but working for the kind of really specific requirements of hospitals. They have a lot of parameters which you need to achieve. And they're very easy to clean, but they mark important locations within the hospital, which is extremely large, so that people can orient themselves, but also gives, for instance, in the waiting area, some visual interest that Chelsea and Westminster have a fantastic arts program, and I believe they metrically sort of study how artworks perform, and they say that it helps with wellness a lot, the ones which they've installed so far, which is, they have an amazing program. I think Yinka might be doing one as well. And in Croydon, the first of my sort of love affair of doing actual projects in Croydon was I won a commission to do 5 large ground art works. So it's this one is not actually where you cross, well, this is partially where you cross the road, but most of the other ones are crossings. And they was called Look Down to Look Up. Very, very simple idea so I'm a huge fan of Croydon. I'm an obsessive skyscraper fanatic, if you believe it or not. And so when I was a kid, I used to go down to Canary Wharf and to Croydon to look at the tall buildings. So I really like them. And I feel like people in Croydon, as in everywhere, don't necessarily look around themselves every day. So the idea was to show buildings that when you're crossing the road, if you look up, they're there. But then when you're looking down, which is what most people do, they're turned into artworks and they celebrate the local context and area. And these were quite popular and they've ended up becoming permanent artworks. So they're still there and they were meant to be 6 months. And I think it's sort of a couple of years later and they're still there. This was Andy Summers and Lee Ivett at Architecture Fringe in Scotland in 2017 invited me to propose what I thought a new town hall for the future of Britain should be like. And this is kind of like an archetype. So it's obviously very specifically my style, if I was ever allowed to go that scale in a city, but it's setting down a series of principles, and there's a kind of manifesto on my website for a town hall that anchors itself in a very proud way, creating a strong civic presence, just because we've had a move over the past 20 to 30 years towards town halls effectively being sold off and offices of councils being put into sort of rented, very banal looking office buildings. And here it's like, you know, a return to materials, artworks covering the architecture made from local materials by local artists in a permanent physical way. Yes, okay, maybe using new technology, but not sort of digital projections and things that come and go, but physical things that will be there in 100 years. And then a series of other things. But the basic principle is civic expression in a really proud and grandiose and celebratory way that talks about local culture and identity, and permanent, using local artists. And I also do interiors sometimes. So because I like to work alone, I have to be very careful with my time. And interior projects, they're quite labor intensive. So I only really take them on if it's like something that I really want to do. And this one in Tokyo was very much that. It's sort of like a Gesamtkunstwerk. I got to do like every little tiny part of the apartment with Japanese contractors and craftsmen who are, I don't think I need to tell people, ridiculously amazing. And it's sort of 160 square meter, sort of colored, saturated, camp manifesto of what I think interior space could be like, or should be like. And for the past 9 years, I've run, together with Anthony Malinowski, who's a fantastic artist, who does architectural scale artworks. We've run Saturated Space at the Architectural Association, which is a research group. And we've done 9 symposiums. Each symposium had multiple lectures. I think we have to have the last one at some point to have 10. And published multiple academic texts and also taught, which has been quite influential in sort of like bringing color into the conversation in a very London context, but over, you know, for 9 years, it's been sort of bringing up ways of discussing it as an active agent politically and phenomenologically. So I'm sort of interested in the sort of political and cultural side of color, and Anthony is very much into the sort of phenomenological, psychological side of color, and it's been quite a good sort of project. And there's lots of texts if anybody wants to check them out, and videos as well as some of the lectures. At the moment, so just thought I'd throw some things that are happening at the moment. I'm doing some products which are either out or coming out very shortly. On the top left and the middle bottom is a series of new handles for Swarf Hardware, who are based in Essex. They're sort of fantastic London-grown hardware company. And they're these sort of little, they're called symbols. They're these little objects which you can sort of either just have as odd socks or the same, or you can have them in sort of like little rows of sentences and hieroglyphs in a series of different colors. Also rugs, bottom left, with floor story. I've got a whole collection which is coming out shortly called Mediterranean. I did not know how appropriate it was going to be. I just did it because I like dreaming of the Mediterranean, but now it's like everyone who sees it is like desperate for holidays, and they see all the rugs which really look like holidays. And there's been a lot of interest because I think it's a good moment for launching a Mediterranean rug collection. The top right two are a series of tiles called Newtown for Bottega Nova in Italy. It's a small company, incredibly skilled craftsmen who still do everything by hand. There's like 8 people in this bottega, who do everything by hand quite slowly. And so these are sort of really gorgeous handmade tiles, which come in ribbed and smooth. And then the bottom right is lots of Italian stuff. Is one of two things I'm doing for De Rosso, which is it's a furniture company in Milan. I'm doing a chair, and this is the coffee table, which is called Lounge Hog. So it's like a little hedgehog for your lounge. And it's a collaboration with Abed Laminati, so that the surface is a sort of high pressure laminate. Again, it's just sort of very durable. And that's where I end.
Great, if you could unshare your screen now.
And not show you anything that I shouldn't.
Why? What's happened before, Adam?
No, we're not going there. I'll tell you after. Far too embarrassing.
You mentioned Abet Laminati a couple of times there, and of course there's a very strong connection between Abet Laminati, which is a laminate maker, and Memphis, because the rumor goes that they sponsored the first Memphis show in Milan, and that's why everything was covered in laminate, that it was just simply a deal.
Yeah.
Is that true?
Well, and in a way, they kind of did that for me as well. So they sponsored my first two shows, and everything was laminate. Similarly.
But with the color and the complex forms that you use in your work, is that deliberate, or is it like the Memphis story, like they were given crazy laminates, so they used them and without really too much thought about it? Is there a story or a rationale behind your choice of color and pattern?
So, I mean, with all the academic stuff that I have done and do, there's a lot of hoity, highfalutin ideas, and I can, sort of write text on it. But I think fundamentally, when it comes down to it, for me, color is an incredibly personal and intuitive thing. I was looking back at my paintings I did when I was a teenager, and it's the same color palette mostly. It's something that very much, I think, comes inside me from the things I experienced as a child. My family is extremely colorful. That was obviously a big influence. And I clearly have a taste for it. Having said that, on each project, there's obviously a lot of work in massaging the color palette to fit the brief and the context and the narrative, or whatever the story is. So for instance, with the collections for Camp Gallery, we actually specifically went to Abed Laminati to ask if we could use their laminates, because they had this high quality print technology, which was new. And it was the only way to achieve affordably, well, relatively affordably, the incredibly high level of intricate ornament that I was looking for, because I was specifically looking at ways of creating ornament which references historical ornament from different countries, mixes them up, and brings them into, I guess, the contemporary with a very bright palette of my own. And Abed's technology was the only one that was available that meant that it was viable. So it's kind of a mixture of like very personal taste and intuition, specific briefs and research, and then also what is possible. I mean, so for instance, the Tokyo project, first of all, the clients weren't particularly interested in patterns so much, but it also wasn't really viable with what was available there. So we very, very early on defaulted into looking at washes, so color washes and textures.
And such colorful patterned work today is actually quite shocking to people. And you picked me up earlier when I said, the Bauhaus and modernism were monochromatic, which, as you rightly said, they weren't. But the legacy of that is that we assume that they were. And so good, in a nutshell, good taste in architectural and design circles often has very little color, very little ornamentation. Why is that? And why do you think that you and the other designers that you talk about are now starting to use color in such a kind of vibrant, in your face kind of way?
As to why people don't use it, I think people only don't use it if you selectively look at creators who don't use it. Because I think maybe those who are celebrated and canonized don't use it. But throughout history, there's plenty of mostly women and queer designers who've always used a lot of color and always used a lot of pattern and ornament right through the 1950s. I mean, a lot of the most popular interior designers were absolutely had nothing to do with all of the minimalist architects. by the way, who most of them I adore, but they're just not canonized. So they're just, it's considered not serious, you know? Nobody would write a book that would, you know, stand on the AA shelf about floral decoration in the 1960s, which there was plenty of. You know, and there's this fantastic book of sort of Baroque between the wars, which talks about how so many spaces for women, lesbians, alternative people were actually done in this sort of incredibly effusive and over elaborate Baroque style. But of course, that's not, you know, that's ignored. So I would just say that actually probably the majority of people do always use it. We don't necessarily see them, which is why I've always, my Instagram has changed because the algorithm on Instagram has killed any possibility of doing diverse things on one stream. But I used to have this series of alternate historiographies of trying to show, and there's other people who still do it almost exclusively, but trying to show people who are not celebrated and not canonized, and how wonderful and interesting their work is. And I would very often get reactions where people go, ugh, what's that? But then after a few weeks or a few months, I would very often get private messages of people going, you know, I thought you were just looking for attention, posting all this stuff, which by the way, is something thrown my way a lot into people who like things that are different. But then they say, you know, now I'm starting to find it all really interesting. And I'm sort of questioning my taste value judgments, which I'd had before, which we get inculcated with generally, but especially if you're in the design profession. I think what's interesting is you find very often you're told that things are good, and that when you present something that doesn't fit into a purely aesthetic, stylistic, sort of acceptable range, if you present something that's outside of that, you're quite heavily beaten back, but very often you're beaten back without clear, good, rational, logical arguments. And sort of accumulatively over 5 years, that has a very strong effect, and you sort of get naturalized into a way of seeing the world, but it's not necessarily a logical or rational one.
So there's a kind of confirmation bias then by a cultural elite, maybe.
So yeah, I mean, in terms of what gets canonized, there's definitely a confirmation bias, but there's also a naturalization which brainwashes people through design education. And look, this is not a critique of design education as a whole, because it's fantastic. There's so many brilliant things within it. I'm only talking about the acceptable range of aesthetics, which obviously for me is everything, but I'm very aware that there's a huge range of other just as important things. But in that area, there's an inculcation into a sort of club of looks. And if you look on Twitter, very often you'll notice that normally there isn't that much substantial critique. It's a lot of sneering and communal sneering, where you're sneering and somebody else is sneering means that you're both sneering, and then you both realize like, haha, we're right, we're in.
Yeah, luckily it all happens on Twitter, where most people don't even bother to go.
No, which is amazing. I finally realized recently that nobody's on Twitter and nobody cares.
And other designers you mentioned, Camille Walala, Yinka Ilori, and Morag Myers-Croft, have you talked to them about this? Does their work come from the same starting point, or is it just a coincidence that this time has thrown up people that also use a lot of color, but perhaps for very different reasons?
So I very much just slapped a label on them without, that's not, you know, that's very much my interpretation. This is probably like me being overly excited and wanting to be part of a club. So you'll need to ask them. I haven't had a discussion about it being a thing, but I have had a couple of, or maybe a bit more than a couple of journalists asking me because they've noticed, and that's what actually put it into my head. I've chatted to Yinka a bit, chatted to Morag quite a lot. And I do think that, you know, obviously very different practitioners, but there are overlapping interests and concerns. And it's, you know, I mentioned them because they're in this sort of world that I really like being in, which is sort of between interiors, architecture, design, art, graphics. And I love inhabiting that space. But I also think that it's a very, very, I think, beautiful and interesting period for British architecture, which I'm not a practicing architect, but I think there's a lot of interesting things happening in a similar way, which also I think similarly might get dismissed as being, oh, just postmodern revival, some of which may be, but I think there's some practitioners within there who are similar to us, rediscovering aesthetics, visual culture, identity, but spatially. And obviously, you know, an example is Yinka doing with Price Gore, but that's him. There's practices doing their own thing, you know, without sticking me on it. or whatever.
And then, of course, fashion architecture tastes were using colour and
Oh yeah,
and historic forms for a long time. And the former members of fashion architecture taste, Sam Jacob, Charles Hollins, Sean Griffiths, are all continuing in their same way. And then also I did a live talk with Space Popular recently, whose work also has a definite crossover with that group that you're talking about. Although what I was going to say about your work, especially when you showed the proposed town hall, was that there doesn't seem to be any kind of reference to elements of contemporary life, for example, technology in your work, where Space Popular, it is all completely embedded in technology. It is virtual reality architecture.
Yeah.
So I guess out of all of that, my question is, does your work kind of deny current technologies and things like that? It does look like something that could have been constructed, at least materially, 500 years ago.
So Space Popular have been really nice to actually invite me to a few of their juries. So I've really had a lot of fantastic, really enjoyable discussions with them about all of these points, because we have very differing relationships to technology. I find theirs fascinating. Mine is, and it already, so I went through the AA when it was a sort of technophiliac Patrick Schumacher period, where everyone was sort of believing that technology had to drive everything, and everything that you did needed to look as if it was made by technology, and therefore it sort of had a particular aesthetic. And if you 3D printed, it should look like sort of, I don't know, alien squid or bones. And no, again, sorry, I can come across as flippant. No,
it's funny, Adam. It's funny. It's genuinely funny.
Obviously, for a sort of extremely camp queer person going through the AA at that time, it was a little bit difficult for me. But I love technology because it was an enabler. So it was seeing it as something that allowed me to do things that I wouldn't otherwise be able to do, which is, for instance, what the Identity Parade project at the Design Museum was all about. It was about technology being harnessed for human purposes. Not problem solving, but like human purposes in relation to sort of identity and expression. And so I think, and also another thing was, I remember telling my father sort of comes from the aeronautical world. Is that the word? Aero things. And I remember telling him, I'm like, oh my God, Dad, there's this technology called CNC and 3D printing. It's amazing. And he's just like, Adam, we've been using that since the 70s. So I think there was also sort of like taking a pinch of salt, like when technology is from, how excited we need to get about it. And I sort of then approached it as allowing me to do things that I wouldn't otherwise be able to. So for instance, and a lot of those had like weird historical resonances. So for instance, my final project at the Architectural Association was a church, a very gay church in the middle of Rome. And I actually made one-to-one voussoirs, so sections of stone vault out of travertine. It's a collaboration with a stone yard in Italy, and these were done using robotic arms. At the time, this is back in 2007, and were not achievable without technology. I mean, done in such a way that 500 years ago it wasn't possible because that level of stereotomy was too complicated, and they were structural and they were ornamental as well. And my approach is pretty much like that. People would look at it, but it wasn't obviously of technology. It wasn't making a fuss about being from technology, but it was using the latest technology to do something that wasn't otherwise possible. So in my work, I'm happy to do things that don't use it in any way, but also when I have the chance, if it's a research project, I will very much run towards it, but always use it in a way that makes it very obvious that the technology is one of equal partners in a bigger mix. So for instance, at the Sir John Soanes Museum, they commissioned a new sculpture, which is the world's largest 3D printed glazed ceramic sculpture, or anything, object, which is part of their collection now. And it's a sort of huge, mad, classical mashup that pissed off the classicists, because it's always fun to piss off the classicists, by doing everything wrong, but also was using technology at the services, basically, of camp and joy and ridiculousness, rather than speaking about itself, which I know is a sort of modernist trait, to talk about the process itself rather than the end result. Oh, I'm not sure if I think I just waffled a lot.
No, but I think what you're saying basically is that for you, technology is an enabler of the culture. It's not the culture in itself.
Yeah, so it's an equal partner agent within the mix, but it shouldn't be fetishized.
Yeah.
I prefer to fetishize sexy things.
You also, several times in your presentation, you said, if I'm allowed to one day build a skyscraper, if I'm allowed to do architecture, as if you're, really? Why would there be any reason why you wouldn't be allowed to? There's a sort of self-deprecation, even perhaps a more sort of insecurity in your approach to your work.
Yeah, yes. I mean, I'm one of those, I think I'm one of those people that just flip-flops between being overly confident and being unbelievably terrified. And also, I think having for someone whose career basically hadn't taken off, already getting a very high media profile quite early on, as a sort of one of not that many queer practitioners in design, one gets a lot of criticism, which it takes a while to learn how to deal with. And it just, I guess it potentially, in some people, it leads to maybe a little bit of tentativeness for a period, but I didn't intend it to come across as self-deprecatory. If you give me a skyscraper, Marcus, I will absolutely kill it.
Well, the commission's unlikely to come from me, but I will definitely put a word in for you. I do often get people saying, who should we use on this job? But also you said you like to work alone. Often people who are insecure or who are doing work that is kind of brave for its time might want to band together. I mean, I guess that's why things like the Bauhaus happen and so on and so forth. Like-minded people come together. Why do you like to work alone? And how the hell would you do a skyscraper on your own?
So I don't necessarily, it's not that I work fully alone. So on different projects, I team up with different people, which is a model that's becoming quite popular now. There's quite a few people that I know of in London doing this, where it means that business-wise, you don't have the problem of so many overheads and employees, but with the security of a project, you team up with different people that you know are good at different parts of projects or different specializations as different consultants. So I just team up with different people on different projects. For instance, I've got this very exciting project, which I can't talk about, in Australia, which is teaming up with an amazing architectural practice there. And I'm sort of plugging into a fantastic team. And because my background, I worked for 8 years in architecture, I know very well how to just fit smoothly into larger design teams. But in terms of actually having the core studio on my own and then sort of scaling up depending on the project, I think I would have liked to be with other people. Like I saw Assemble going off, because there's a lot of us sort of generation, what are we called? Millennials, who found it quite difficult to sort of get our businesses off the ground just because of the financial situation. I'm unfortunately, the new generation will probably find it difficult now as well. And some people banded together, Assemble being, in the most famous example, doing amazing work. But actually I basically couldn't find anyone at that time in the London design world who was in even vague, I mean, I had lots of friends, so I was friends with most people doing these things, but nobody who was interested in the same things as me and wanted to pair up or team up. I think what I'm very passionate about can sometimes be seen as just very superficial, and that people won't take it seriously. And it's just objects or things like that. So I ended up effectively financing my work through working at offices that were very amenable and supportive to somebody who was working all night and falling asleep on the computer during the day. Ron Arad being the one, he sort of carried me for about 3 years, basically doing all of these things. But yeah, I just couldn't find any sort of like-minded people. I think what's fantastic is, especially also as my advocacy and stuff on Instagram, I've had a lot of young queer practitioners, students, people just coming into the industry. And from what I'm understanding them approaching me, the makeup of the design profession is radically transforming. And I just think the new generation that are starting to come up now are going to be so cool. And I'd love to hook up with them. I'll be like sugar daddy.
And what do you mean by that? So cool in who they are as people, or in the work that they're doing, and what defines them as practitioners or as people?
I think they're a lot less respectful of the supposed canon. They're a lot less respectful, not in a bad way, but like they question things a lot more. They're a lot more FU in terms of doing things that would be considered outre. They're just a lot queerer, and there's a lot odder kids out there who are sort of not allowing themselves to be beaten back, and they're sort of really proud to do odd things. And on top of that, the new generation of teachers, I think sort of my generation and sort of maybe sort of a bit older, but they're also more forgiving. It's less like the way that you design things or the way something looks is a life and death decision. If you don't do it right, you must be killed because you're sort of undermining the profession. It's just not like that anymore. I think things have really changed and are really changing. And there's a sort of more of, I was telling you the other day about Dezeen Awards. People sort of, I've heard a lot of people saying there's too many of them, and I was saying that there's too few. And when I was saying that there's too few, I don't think that lots of ones just for taking money off designers should be set up, but like proper ones that celebrate very different ways of designing by different people who are now coming into design. And I'm seeing that in the students when I'm invited to crits. There's a much bigger diversity of approaches now than I had seen when I was a student or before that, but genuinely different approaches that exist simultaneously. And it's not like just people who are into 3D printers, which is great. No, there's also people who are into sort of queer theory. There are people who are into color. There are people who are really into politics and the sort of mechanisms of legislation at the same time as people who are really into aesthetics. And they all operate now at the same time. And I think some architects and designers see it as chaos and there's a mess and there's no consensus, but I just see it as really great.
And you often, when you're talking about your work, you're using terms like cuteness, campness, queerness. What do they mean? How can you have a camp? What does a camp bit of work mean? And I mean, we all have a kind of a preconception of what that means, but to you, what does it mean when you use those words?
So it's obviously very contended and contentious, the definition of these words. So I always make very clear that I use them in my own way about my work with my approach. So it's my specific interpretation only. But for me, camp is, again, I guess it starts taking from Susan Sontag's descriptions as a starting point. A sort of, it's a bit problematic that this sort of academic with a sort of slight distance looking down at all these people making camp things, sort of, her text is still canonical, but it's a very good description. It's an unequivocal, unironic, joyous celebration of self-expression without the donning of a hat to any existing mainstream taste cultures that could be or would be or is considered bad taste by those people at the center of aesthetic power, but enjoys itself so much more. So I think she said something quite funny, which is it's the good taste of bad taste. So it's the ability to enjoy everything outside of the canon in an unironic way. So like the enemy of camp is a guilty pleasure. That's the enemy of camp. Camp is you just enjoy it and you really go to the nth degree. You don't hold back. There's no restraint. There's no trying to fit in. It's you, and it's a project that you continue individually over whole life. And I kind of use it quite interchangeably with the word style, which I use, I think, possibly differently to a lot of people or some people in design and architecture. So for me, style is not a whole way of designing or a whole approach, which is, I guess, codified in relation to culture with a set of specific meanings in a sort of Semperian way, Gottfried Semper, like an eon's style. For me, it's style like personal style. It's like taste. So it's you creating your own idea of what is good to express yourself, your own idea of beauty, your own individual taste standards and culture, which you then express by having a hell of a lot of style. It's a kind of liberal idea rather than a collectivist idea of style. So yeah, for me, they kind of go hand in hand. So I think camp is very often a sort of description like Susan Sontag, someone standing outside, looking in from a world of like high culture, that things are sort of bad, a good taste of bad taste. But then style is a way of saying it of just these people expressing themselves in a liberal culture, in a fulsome and celebratory way.
And in all the conversation we've been having about your work, we haven't really touched on sort of the program of space, the program of architecture. What are your views on that? I mean, if you were to design this skyscraper, we've got a clear idea of what it would look like, but how would it be used? Would it just be taking ideas from elsewhere, or would you have radical new ideas as well of circulation and the way that space would be used for different functions?
So I'm going to try not to be self-deprecatory here, but it's hard because because
I'll tease you if you do.
My personal interest is in, I guess, modifying existing models. Okay, so also when I give a talk about sort of what for me queering architecture and design is, it's about taking existing archetypes and models and distorting them just enough that they seem fresh or strange, but that they're still very much recognizable in some way. And so that's about my, also as a Jewish person, it's my understanding and the history in my past of the relationship between centers of power and otherness, and the fact that, I guess, sort of my background, sort of a lot of Jewish people throughout Jewish European history, and also queer people, have always had their foot in the centers of power, but also they're very suspect and they're outside. And so I just feel it fits with me, like modifying existing things. So I would never see myself as radically reinventing. However, because my interest is sort of on the modification of things as they look, and they're still recognizable, but different things happen when I collaborate. So I really like collaborating with people who do like to reimagine or completely transform the program or the way that our bodies exist in routine in space at a larger scale. That is something that I like doing at a small scale. So for instance, I could really reimagine the hell out of a bathroom or a boudoir or an apartment. That's a scale that I really understand. But I think when I go larger scale, I stick very much to the visible and the visual. But I'd love to work with a sort of contemporary OMA who completely reimagines the program as well. And I did my internship at OMA, and I found all of that way of working absolutely fascinating, the sort of messing with program always from the get-go.
Maybe they're watching. And
yeah, hello.
Finally, this situation of lockdown, of coronavirus, I've asked everyone I've spoken to about what do they think the implications are for their profession and what they do. Do you have any thoughts on that? As someone who likes to work alone, I guess lockdown suits you down to the ground, but will what you do and will your output change because of this pandemic? You personally and the profession you're in?
I mean, it might change economically because it's it's quite a difficult situation.
Oh yeah, well that happened already, right?
Yeah. No. Well, no. I would like to say I hope not. Obviously there's my work might dry up, but in terms of my way of working and the things that I would like to design, if anything, it just reinforces what I think is important and what I love in design, and how design can be important to people at a domestic environment, at the domestic scale, even more when you're trapped in your home the whole time. But also, so there's two scales that I'm really wanting to work in at the moment. It's sort of the domestic products and objects for the home and surfaces, and also really large scale public art, which is about the everyday as well, but out in the city, creating sort of backgrounds, Zoom backgrounds, but in real life, that literally color that people's everyday life. And that's not going to change. I'm more desperate than I ever have been in my whole life to go outside, to go to a restaurant, to go to a cafe, to talk to people. I don't think it's necessarily going to change my relationship to design very much. Yeah. Oh, just one quick. I just want to go back to the technology question very, very quickly, very briefly. But so technology is important, but also in relation to the objects that I like designing and the public spaces that I'm doing. I guess I fetishize, but there's nothing for me that ever gets quite as close as a real thing that doesn't move, that's static and inert, but has enough of a presence to trigger the imagination, so that there's a kind of like dialogue, which is the most fundamental type of technology. It's us looking at things that we have fabricated and creating a world between us. And I'm kind of one of those weird people that I sit at home and just like stare at my porcelain Meissen figurine in the sunset, the sunset light that sort of glints on its glaze as the evening comes in. and it makes me immensely happy. And it also takes me out of myself. It calms me down. And I've had, like a lot of my friends, I know I've had some difficulty in this period being productive, panicking, and interesting objects of design have actually, they very much helped me reach a state of almost meditation, just because the interest, the visual interest, some people say beauty, the material qualities, the intricacy in the ornament gives your eye. It's why mandalas and yantras in Buddhism and in India are used as meditation devices, because they take you out of yourself. So I think if I was in a white room for this lockdown, I would have had a nervous breakdown, because there's nothing to look at to take your mind outside of itself and calm down. So yeah, I guess the end result of all that technology is always for a thing that I can touch. Like in the Identity Parade video for the Design Museum, there's quite a long video of me like licking a vase and getting quite erotic with it. And then another one, actually I have several licking videos, because and then there was a video I made at the AA, and it was me sort of having a relationship with a really beautiful print. And I think that sort of summarizes the end result of all the technology. It's like, it's a physical thing that is technological in a way that like a pot 10,000 years ago would have been technological, but just much, much more intricate. I
was going to say before that I hope you get to go to a restaurant soon and hang out with real people. And I'm sorry if I'm a poor substitute for that, but it's been really great talking to you. And I hope to see you in the real world before too long. Thanks so much, Adam.
No, thank you very much. Bye.
Bye.